Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The sun was going down, but its soft light shone through the windows on the west side, making the face of a sick person in bed look bright. To the people by the bed, it seemed like a heavenly light had touched the dying person's forehead. There were only two people watching: a girl of 14, tall for her age, with gray eyes that sometimes looked green and dark, curly hair like a boy's, and a middle-aged woman who had taken care of the girl when she was a baby and was now like a friend and helper to the sick person. Mrs. Ashe had been lying quietly all day. A year ago, her husband had brought her to California because she was very sick with a disease called consumption. He hoped that the change from the cold winds of New England to the warm air of California would make her better. At first, she did seem to get better, but then her husband got sick and died suddenly. After that, Mrs. Ashe got sick again, and this time, she couldn't fight the disease. Even though she felt very weak, Mrs. Ashe wanted to live, especially for her daughter Helen. But she couldn't fight anymore, so she lay there, knowing she was going to die soon. All day, she had been thinking and waiting to say something important. Finally, with the sunset shining on her face, she called the woman, who came closer. "When I'm gone, Woods," she said calmly, "you'll take Helen to my sister's house in Boston. You'll travel slowly so Helen won't get too tired. She won't need money because she has enough. She'll only need love and care, which my sister will give her. I hope you can stay with her, but it's up to Mrs. Mason. You'll find out about my things later. You'll bury me next to my husband and then take Helen away. Everything is arranged, so there won't be any problems. Now, please, leave me alone with my daughter for a while." The woman left the room, and Mrs. Ashe hugged Helen tightly. Helen lay quietly in her mother's arms, like a baby being comforted. Helen was a mix of being impulsive and controlling her feelings. She loved her parents very much and had focused all her love on them. When her father died, she stayed strong to help her mother. Now, she was trying to stay strong again so her mother wouldn't feel sad because of her own sadness. As she lay there with her mother, Helen's eyes were wide open and dry, but they looked very sad. She was almost as pale as her mother. "My dear," her mother said gently, "how can I leave you alone? Promise me one thing. Open your heart to new love. I know you might want to keep your grief to yourself and feel like you're betraying me if you care for your Aunt Helen. She'll love you because of me, and she'll be like a second mother to you. We were very close sisters, and she's a wise and kind woman. Her daughter, Laura, is about your age, and she must be a good person too. Try to care for them, my dear. A life without love is empty. Will you try?" "Oh, Mom," Helen cried, suddenly sobbing. "I'll try because you asked me to. I'll try, but how can I love them? How can I watch another girl be happy with her mom, knowing you'll never be with me again? Never, ever. Even if I call out day and night, you'll never hear or answer. My dear mother, why do you have to leave me? My dear, I have to. I would have stayed for you if I could. You've always been my comfort. Comfort me a little longer. Promise me you'll try to live bravely for my sake." The last words were hard for Mrs. Ashe to say, and Helen felt that her mother's cheek was colder than before. She held on to her mother tightly, stopping herself from crying out loud. They stayed like that, very quietly, in their last embrace. The sun went down and the evening grew darker. A young moon appeared in the sky, casting its faint light on the faces of the mother and daughter lying on the bed. The mother moved a little and hugged her child tightly. She whispered softly, "Goodbye, my darling," and then she seemed to fall asleep. Helen might have slept too, but an hour later, Woods gently woke her up. "You need to get up now, Miss Helen, and let me take care of your mother." She passed away peacefully, like a lamb. "Her face looks peaceful and happy now," Woods said kindly but firmly. Helen didn't know what the next few days would be like. She kept her feelings inside, as she always did. She turned away from the graves of her parents, lying side by side, and helped calmly with all the preparations for her long journey. When she finally arrived at her aunt's house in Boston, who was like second mother for her, she couldn't keep up her calmness anymore. Her Aunt Helen looked so much like her mother that Helen found it hard to bear. When her aunt hugged her, almost as lovingly as her mother would have, Helen shivered and burst into tears for a moment before stopping herself. "I have to love you for my mother's sake," she said. Those were some of her last words. "I'll try, but I feel like I left my heart in her grave." Mrs. Mason, Helen's aunt, was indeed a wise and kind woman. She didn't try to force Helen to love her or be interested in her. Instead, she was gentle and considerate, trying to make Helen feel at home in many small ways. Laura, Mrs. Mason's daughter, had hoped that Helen would be the sister she always wanted, but Helen's cold and distant manner disappointed her. Helen's reserved attitude made Laura feel like she was being pushed away. The summer passed without bringing them closer. Helen couldn't help feeling sad when she saw Laura happy with her parents. Helen had no one left but her dead parents. She couldn't even talk to Woods because Mrs. Mason decided not to keep her. So Helen kept all her thoughts and feelings to herself, pondering them in her heart. Things got a little better when school started in the fall. Helen and Laura were in the same classes, which brought them closer together, but they still weren't truly friends. In the spring, there was going to be a test, and a medal would be given to the best student. By winter, it was clear that Helen and Laura were the top students, and they started to compete fiercely. Mrs. Mason watched sadly, sticking to her policy of not interfering. One day, Helen overheard Laura asking her mother for help with a French method they had learned last summer. "Mama, you know you have the key to that French method locked up in your desk. Can you please lend it to me? If I had it, I'd be sure to do well. I'd study just as hard. It would make a big difference," Laura said. Helen listened from behind the curtain. If Laura had the key, she would definitely do well. Mrs. Mason answered sadly, with a hint of disappointment in her voice. I didn't think you would want to do something that wasn't honest. You know you're not supposed to use the key. The real test is to work without it, and the exam will show how well you've done. I guess there's no point in asking anymore. I wish you were easier to persuade, Mama. No, you don't. You just think you do. Deep down, you'd rather have me like this, Mrs. Mason replied, and Helen felt once again the bitterness of seeing Laura have a home and mother while she only had a distant grave. But at least, Helen thought, she would win in this school competition. If Laura did better than her, Helen wouldn't be able to bear it. Weeks went by and spring arrived. The old garden behind the house, where Helen's mother used to play as a child, filled with bird songs and flowers. Nature seemed to laugh with joy. Springs bubbled, flowers bloomed, and sunshine warmed everything.
Birds s'empilaient.
But Laura and Helen were too focused and tired to enjoy it. They only studied. They slept with books under their pillows and woke up early to study again. Finally, the week of the exam arrived. Helen felt confident about everything except her French. If she could just have the key for a short time, she knew she'd be perfect. She couldn't stop thinking about it. In her passionate heart, she said she'd rather die than let Laura win at school. Laura had everything else. Why should she have this too? At first, she thought, if only it were right to have the key. Then she thought, if only she could stumble upon the key somehow. Then, if only she could find the key in her aunt's desk. Finally, she decided, I will find the key somehow. On the morning before the exam, she got up from her bed in the pretty blue room her aunt had decorated for her and quietly went downstairs in the early spring morning. Her bare feet made no noise on the thick carpet. She looked like a small ghost in white, but no ghost ever had such excited red cheeks and wide gray-green eyes. She held a bunch of keys that belonged to her mother. She hoped one of them would fit her aunt's desk. She was trembling with excitement. She had forgotten about the wrongness of her actions and thought only about how winning would feel. She stood in front of the desk and tried one key after another with trembling fingers. Finally, one key fit. In a moment, she had the key to the French method in her hand. She quickly compared her work with it and made corrections. She was so focused that she didn't notice another figure in white quietly following her down the stairs, watching what she was doing and then leaving. Helen hurried back to bed, her eyes shining and cheeks burning. Meanwhile, Laura went to her mother, full of excitement. Mr. Mason was away on business, so Laura climbed into her mother's empty side of the bed. "Mama," she said, "wake up and listen quickly." Her patient mother rubbed her eyes and listened to Laura's story, breathless with excitement. "Of course she'll win now," Laura said, finishing her story, "unless I tell Mademoiselle what she did. But you wouldn't want that, would you, Mama?" But her French was the weakest part. Did you ever see anything so sneaky? Sneaking into your desk with someone else's keys and then making all those corrections. Yes, I agree, Mrs. Mason replied, almost groaning. And she's Laura's daughter, my poor Laura, who valued honor and honesty. You don't know, dear, how painful this is for me. Poor Laura. What if she knows? But what should we do, Mama? Should we just stay quiet and let her win the medal and let everyone think she won it fairly? Or should we tell her what we know? Can you go away for now, Mrs. Mason said, and come back before breakfast? I want to think about what's best to do. When Laura returned, Mrs. Mason had decided on her plan of action, or rather, inaction. Don't be upset, darling, she said to Laura. I know it'll seem unfair to lose because of her cheating, but there are more important things. Right now, it's crucial to understand Helen's character. If she's not completely unworthy of her mother, she'll feel sorry before it's too late. If she doesn't, then we'll think about what to do next. So I have to let her win unfairly and not say anything? Laura asked, a hint of rebellion in her voice. Yes, if you're the obedient and kind Laura I know you are. Mama, you always know how to persuade me. And who usually admits, eventually, that it was the best way. Mrs. Mason asked, laughing. Mama, you're spoiling me. Let's see if I agree that this was the best way this time. On the first day of the exam, they had their French test. Laura and Helen were at the top of the class. Laura did well, but Helen did exceptionally, and she sat down amidst compliments and praises. But the victory didn't feel as good as she thought it would. She didn't even look at Laura, and she wouldn't have understood the look of scorn on Laura's face, as she didn't know her aunt had seen her raiding the desk. Yet she wasn't happy. She didn't need scorn from others. She already felt bitter self-contempt burning inside her. She realized how wrong her actions had been and wished she could exchange her success for the worst possible failure. Mrs. Mason watched her and whispered to Laura as they left, "Be kind to her. She'll suffer tonight." At dinner, Helen's seat was empty. She sent word that she had a headache. Her aunt sent her some tea, strawberries, and bread and butter, and then left her alone. The poor, lonely, miserable girl lay on her bed and thought. It hadn't been a year since she lay in her mother's arms and heard her say, "Try to live honorably for my sake." Those were almost her mother's last words. After that, there was only a soft sigh, as if it came from far away, saying, "Goodbye, darling." The sunlight touched her sad face gently and then left. Later, the cold stars looked down at her, still fighting her inner battle. Her conscience told her one thing. She had to undo this wrong, no matter how shameful it might be. At first, Helen considered going to her aunt and confessing everything, seeking her help and advice. But she lacked the courage to admit her shame and lay back down. Throughout the long night, she hardly slept. But by morning, she had made up her mind. She had received praise for her wrong actions publicly, so she would publicly make amends and face humiliation. Once she decided on her course of action, sleep finally found her tired eyes, and she fell into a forgetful slumber until the breakfast bell woke her. That day, everyone noticed a strange calmness and determination in her demeanor. She passed the remaining exams successfully, but with a noticeable lack of interest in the results, which puzzled everyone except her aunt. Finally, it was time for the medal to be awarded. There was a brief discussion among the committee members, and then the chairman stood up, holding the medal. "To Miss Helen Ashe," he began, but Helen interrupted him. Her face was pale, and her eyes were determined, but her voice was steady and emotionless, as if she had resigned herself beyond hope or fear. "The medal doesn't belong to me," she said. "My success was dishonest. I found the key to the French method and used it to correct my mistakes, or else I would have failed. The prize rightfully belongs to my cousin, Laura Mason." The chairman, flustered, struggled to adjust his prepared speech. "Oh my," he exclaimed absent-mindedly, before finally managing to announce Laura Mason as the rightful recipient of the medal. He then sat down, his confusion masked by gentle applause. That night, Mrs. Mason visited Helen in her room as twilight fell. As she entered, she said, "My darling," in a voice so reminiscent of Helen's mother's that it stirred something deep within Helen. "My darling, I now know that you are true and brave, just like your mother." But Helen withdrew into the darkness, her voice trembling with tears as she asked, "Is there anyone who could know what I've done and not despise me? No one, dear, who dares to scorn a soul that repents and makes amends." With loving arms, her aunt embraced the lonely girl, and Helen knew she was no longer alone. She had found a new home in her mother's sister's heart.